We have the core functionality of our WPF MVVM application, but we're ready to make our application more powerful. And to do that, I ultimately want to read and write our reservations from a database. Now, to do this interaction with the database, we're going to be creating service classes. And a service class, in my opinion, is a self-contained class that performs some kind of business logic. Now, keep in mind, I say opinionated because the definition of a service really does vary between contexts such as a web service or a Windows service that runs in the background, and it's also a pretty broad term, so people even have their own definitions of services as well. But in our case, just a class that performs a specific piece of business logic. But if we look at our model, you might ask, well, you already have business logic in here, so why isn't this a service? And ideally, I would like to keep my business logic in the model, but in this case, we're going to be interacting with a database, and I don't want that database to infest my model layer, so I do want to extract and encapsulate that database interaction into a service. And last thing before we get started, if I had to put services into either M for models, V for views, or VMs for view models, then I would put it into the model layer. So to get started, as we see, we are in the reservation book right now, and currently we just have a list of reservations in our reservation book. So we are storing our reservations in memory. That's not what we want. We want to store these in a database. So to store these reservations in a database, we're going to be using Entity Framework. So let's head into our Manage NuGet packages and browse for Entity Framework Core. And I'm using .NET 5, so I will install version 5.0.5. Let's install that. And I'm also going to need a database provider. And I think the easiest to set up will be SQLite. So we will search for Entity Framework Core.SQLite. Here we go, second item in the list. Let's install that, version 5.0.5 again. Same as our version for Entity Framework Core. Now, first thing we have to do with Entity Framework is create a DbContext. So I was debating where to put this DbContext. I could put it in the services folder, but I think I'm just going to create a new folder for DbContext. And in here, we're going to have our reservum DbContext. And we will inherit from DbContext as all DbContext do need to do. And the most important thing we need here in the DbContext is a DB set to interact with our reservations. So let's create a property for that, a DB set, the type being our reservation, and we'll call this reservations. But we kind of have an issue here. Let's go look at our reservation. And this does have properties for the data we want to write to the database, but there's no setters on any of these properties. So it's going to be kind of hard to map these to the database. We could add setters to these properties, but then that would conflict with the requirements that we discussed in the models part of the series. So we can't do that. There's also no ID property that we could use as a primary key. And we also have other business logic on our reservation, such as calculating the length of the reservation and checking if a reservation conflicts with another reservation. And this logic we really do not need in the database layer. So really what I'm saying is that I don't want to use this reservation as the type for my DB set. Instead, what we're going to do is create a different object that'll be dedicated to our database layer and will map to the database perfectly. And we're going to call this the reservation DTO. So DTO, data transfer object, and all its job is going to do is transfer our data between our application and the database. So let's create a new folder in our application. We'll call this DTOs, and we'll have a reservation DTO. So this DTO should match the columns that we're going to have in our database. So we are going to have a GUID for the reservation ID, and this is going to be the primary key. So we can decorate this with a key attribute. Let's import that. So another nice benefit of using DTOs is that our domain object doesn't have to be littered with a bunch of data annotations. We can keep those in our DTO. I also want to write the room ID, and this contains a floor number and room number. So I'm going to put both of these as columns in my reservation table. So let's create properties for those, the floor number and room number. And then we do want the username, start time, and end time of the reservation. So we can just copy these in and add some setters. So now this is going to match our database table perfectly, whereas if we had used the reservation class, it kind of would have been a mess. We would have had to do some weird stuff to map the room ID to columns. Now keep in mind, some applications do have very simple models, and in those cases you can reuse the model as the type for your DB set. But here in the DB set, let's import our DTO. So now that our DbContext is complete, we're ready to generate our database. Now to do that, we're going to need another package, and this is Microsoft.entityframeworkcore.tools. Let's install version 5.0.5, same as our Entity Framework Core version. And once that is done, we can head over to the Package Manager console, and we'll create a migration for this database schema that we currently have. So to do that, we will use add migration, and we'll name this migration initial. So it's our very first one. So there we go, starting to do that. And we get an error because no database provider has been configured yet. And there's multiple ways to do this. We could do it directly in the DbContext, which is easy, but then we're hard coding our connection string most likely. We could use add DbContext, which is the best option, but we don't have a service provider set up right now. And the last option, which they don't actually list, but the option that we are going to use is a design time DbContext factory. So we can add a class to our DbContext folder. We'll call this the ReservationProvider design time DbContext factory, and we're going to inherit from design time DbContext factory. And the type of our DbContext is the ReservationProvider DbContext. So let's implement this interface, and in here, we're going to configure our DbContext, and the DbContext that we return from this method will be used for our migrations. So to configure a DbContext, we're going to use DbContext options. So we can create a DbContext options builder, and we can use this builder to specify our database configuration. So we just want to use SQLite and pass in a connection string. And I think the way this goes is data source equals the path to our file database. So we're just going to have reservation.db. So just a relative path, it'll probably just throw it in the bin. And now we're going to build our options by calling options. And this returns DbContext options. So let's put these into a variable. And we're going to pass these options to the DbContext that we return from this method. So let's generate a constructor that'll take in those options. And that's actually all we have to do because we pass it to the base constructor, which also takes the options, and that'll take care of everything for us. So now let's add migrations again, and it was successful. Here's our migrations. Here's the table that we're going to create. Looks good. So I do want to say we are still hard coding our connection string right here, but this is the design time DbContext factory. So if you were to check this into source control, you could just exclude this file. We are not going to be using this at runtime. Now to actually generate our database, we could just use update database here, and that does create our database and run the migrations, but it puts our database at the root of our project, and our application is going to be running from the bin. And since our connection string is a relative path, our application is going to be looking for the database in the bin. So this is not going to work. We do not want the database here. And the easiest way to get our database to generate in the bin is to generate our database on application startup. So we can get our DbContext in our startup method. Just instantiate that. We're going to need DbContext options again. Let's just copy those over from the design time DbContext factory. We'll move our connection string to a const variable. So the connection string, eventually you might want to move that to a config file or something. And now pass in those options. And to run migrations, we can use our DbContext, get the database, and just call migrate. And now if we run this, we didn't get any errors. And if I go into my bin, we have our reservation.db file, and it has 20 kilobytes, so it did run those migrations. It does have data associated with it. So finally, we have our database set up. Let's start creating our services. So I'll create a new folder in my services folder, and this is going to be for the reservation providers. So I am going to create an interface here for an ReservationProvider because I eventually want to depend on interfaces throughout my models so that I'm not directly dependent on the database, and it'll also make unit testing possible. So we are going to have a ReservationProvider interface, and all this is going to do is asynchronously, so it's going to be a task, give us back a collection of reservations. So import reservation from our models. Keep in mind, this is the reservation, not the reservation DTO. I don't want my database stuff to leak throughout my model layer. And this is just going to be called get all reservations. So now let's implement this interface with a class. This will be the database reservation provider. Implement the interface. And for this, we're going to use our DbContext to get the reservations from the database. But one thing I did not cover in this startup is that the DbContext is not a long-lived object. And what I mean by that is that we should dispose of this DbContext when we're done using it. So we can wrap it in a using statement and then it'll get disposed. But that also means that in this reservation provider, we're going to have to create a new DbContext in this method. So to do that, we're going to create a new class, the ReservationDbContext factory. And the difference between this and the design time DbContext factory is that we're not going to be hard coding the connection string in this DbContext factory. So in fact, we can copy most of this into the DbContext factory, get rid of the hard coded connection string. Instead, we're going to get that through the constructor. So read only field, generate our constructor, and import our DbContext option stuff. And we also don't need these string args anymore. That was just for the design time DbContext factory. And now we're ready to use this. So in the database reservation provider, we're going to have our DbContext factory as a field coming from the constructor. And then to get our reservations, this is going to be pretty straightforward. We're first going to create our DbContext using our factory, and then use the context to get the reservations using just a toList async. I think we have to import that. There we go. And we have to await this and make this method async. And actually, this gives us back our reservation DTOs. So we're gonna have to map those to reservations. So we got our DTOs, and what we're gonna do is use some link to map those using select. So map the DTO to a new reservation, and this takes a room ID. We can instantiate one of those using our DTO's floor number and room number. We got our username on the DTO, we have our start time on the DTO, and we have our end time. And this line is kind of long. Let's extract this to a method. We'll call this toReservation, so mapping a DTO to a reservation, and then we'll simply return these reservations. So all good there. What else do we need on our model? We're going to need a service to create a reservation. So let's create a new folder in our services, the reservation creators. We'll create an interface that we're ultimately going to depend on the ReservationCreator, and this will have a simple asynchronous method. I don't think it has to return anything in this case, and we'll just call it create reservation, and it'll take in the reservation that we want to create in the database. So let's implement this as a class. Same kind of pattern, the database reservation creator. Implement our brand new interface. We're going to need our DbContext factory in here again, so I'm just going to copy this from the ReservationProvider, paste that in, update the constructor name, import what we need, and let's use that DbContext from our DbContext factory. And this mapping is going to be the opposite of our ReservationProvider, where we went from DTO to reservation. This time we want to go from reservation to DTO. So I'm going to do the same thing and put that into a method, which is going to return a reservation DTO. We'll call this toReservationDTO, and this will map from our reservation model. And let's generate that method. So one thing I want to mention is that this will be a really good use case for AutoMapper, which is a popular library to map objects to and from one another rather than manually doing it with these methods. So there's probably plenty of tutorials out there if you're interested in doing that automatically, but for now, just going to keep it simple and manually do it. So we can set all these properties from our reservation. We should probably null check the room ID just in case. We need a fallback value. We can just do 0, and then we just get everything else from the reservation as well. So username, start time, and end time. We got everything we need. We can write this to the database now, and to do that, we'll take our context, get our reservations DB set, and add our reservation DTO, and then we can just save our changes using save changes async, and that'll write everything to the database. And we have to await this and make our method async, and now we're ready to use our services in our model. So instead of storing these reservations in memory, we're going to get them from an ReservationProvider. And then to add a reservation, we're going to use an ReservationCreator. And we'll get both of these through the constructor so we can get rid of our old one. And now we're going to have to use these services. So get all reservations, we'll use the ReservationProvider, which means that all of this is going to have to be async now. And we'll await this. And now to add a reservation, we're going to use our ReservationCreator to create the reservation, and let's make this async as well and await that. But now the last issue we have is checking for conflicts, and what we could do is just get all reservations here asynchronously, but that would be loading all reservations into memory for this loop, when really we could just have a database query that checks for conflicts, and then we wouldn't actually have to load all of the reservations. So we are going to create another service to interact with the database and perform this conflict business logic. So let's create a new folder in our services. We'll call this the ReservationConflictValidators. That sounds pretty cool. Create an interface for that, and we'll have a single method that'll return true or false. So does it conflict or does it not conflict? And we'll call this method does cause conflict, and that'll take in the reservation that we want to test for conflicts. So does the reservation cause conflicts? Let's create a class to implement this interface. The database ReservationConflictValidator. Implement our interface again. Let's get our DbContext in here, so just copy this constructor. And now we're gonna have to create our DbContext again. Let's just copy this using statement. And what we're gonna do is take our reservations DB set, and what we can actually do is map our reservation DTOs to reservations. So we're gonna need the same mapper that we have in our ReservationProvider. I think for now I'm just gonna copy and paste this, but ideally I would move this into a class so we can reuse it, and then we can use any async, and we can pass in a predicate, and we want to check if any reservation in the database conflicts with our incoming reservation. And that'll return the true false that we want for does cause conflict. So we can simply await that and return the value. All right, that was easier than expected actually. Now let's get that ReservationConflictValidator in here. We can just add that to the constructor. And oh, one sec. So for this reservation conflict exception, I do want to pass in the conflicting reservation. So I'm going to change this real quick. And instead of returning true false, we're going to return the conflicting reservation. And we'll call this get conflicting reservation. And make sure we update this method. And instead of any async, we can use first or default async. And let's update this method name. So there we go, simple fix. So now we will get the conflicting reservation by using our reservation conflict validator and passing in the incoming reservation. And if the conflicting reservation does not equal null, that means there is a conflict and we do want to throw our conflict exception and pass in the conflict. So there we go. Now we have all of our add reservation logic tucked away into our services. And we wrap these in interfaces so our domain model does not depend on our database. But now let's head up in our model to our hotel, and our reservation book takes a bunch of services now. I think what I'm going to do is just pass in the reservation book as a parameter to our hotel. So we'll take care of all those services higher up. And now all of this has to be async since we call into our reservation book. So make sure we await everything, make everything a task. And now we have to pass in our reservation book. So we'll instantiate that, and that needs a ReservationProvider, a ReservationCreator, and a ReservationConflictValidator. So let's create some locals for that as well. So we'll create some variables for all of these and instantiate those using the database versions. And then all of these need a DbContext factory. So we can create that real quick and pass in our connection string. And actually, I'm going to put this DbContext factory into a field. And the reason I'm doing that is so that we can just use that down here. So I created DbContext, don't need our options defined here now. A little bit simpler. But now let's pass in the DbContext factory everywhere. And this is kind of starting to get messy. So setting up a dependency injection container would definitely be beneficial, I think. Maybe we'll look into that later. And now we're almost ready to test this out. The only issue is that we changed our hotel methods. So these are async now, and we call these in our commands. So our make reservation command calls make reservation, but we don't await this. So what we're going to need is an async command. So let's create an async command base that will handle all the async logic and that we can inherit from. And this can actually inherit from command base. And I'm going to cover this quickly because I do have another video on async commands that I recommend checking out. But we are going to make this abstract still. And we're going to have an abstract method to allow us to execute async. And then we'll make execute an async void. And we'll await execute async. But before execution, we're going to set an is executing flag to true. And then afterwards, we'll set that to false. So create a property for that. And I actually want this to be private. So can't change is executing from outside the class. And when is executing changes, I want to call on can execute changed because we are going to override can execute. And we can only execute if we are currently not executing. So this makes sure that we cannot spam the button, which would definitely be an issue because this execution is async and it could be a long-running execution. And actually, I should wrap this in a try finally, so that if we get exceptions, then we will set is executing the false. Keep in mind there is weird behavior with async void and exception handling, and I cover that more in my async command video. But for now, we're just going to make sure that all of our commands handle their own exceptions. But now we can change this to an async command base, make this override execute async, and now we can gracefully await this. There we go, all good. We also said that we are going to catch all exceptions and handle them here in our command. So if we get some kind of weird database exception, I definitely want to handle that and show a message box. So just failed to make reservation. And now for loading reservations, we do that in our reservation listing view model. So doing this asynchronously is a little bit difficult, but the easiest way to do it is to create another command, and this will be the load reservations command. It'll have to be an async command, so implement that. And this will take our hotel, which we'll use to get the reservations. And it's also going to take our reservation listing view model so that we can pass the reservations to that view model. So let's get those through the constructor and let's set up this command. So this will be the load reservations command. Instantiate that, passing in this view model and our hotel. And now rather than calling update reservations here, we're going to execute our load reservations command, but I don't actually want to do that in the constructor because I do like my constructors to really not do anything and be simple. So what I'm going to do is have a static factory method on here that'll give me back a reservation listing view model, and I'll call this load view model, and it'll take the same dependencies as our viewModel does through the constructor. And what this will do, will instantiate the viewModel, pass in the dependencies, and then it'll take that viewModel and load it using the load reservations command. And then we can return the viewModel, which will be loading. So we're going to do the loading in here. Let's do that real quick. So load the reservations using our hotel. We should probably try catch this just in case and do a message box in here. So let's just copy this from our make reservation command. So failed to load reservations this time as our message. But now we have our reservations and we can send those to the viewModel. So we'll call update reservations, which is currently private. We want that to be public, and it'll take the reservations as a parameter and just iterate over those. So we do not have to do anything async in here. In fact, we don't even need our hotel in a field anymore because we don't use it down there. So get rid of that. And now keep in mind, we are loading and we don't have any loading indicator on the UI. So we might want to look into adding that later. And now the last thing we have to do is in our App.xaml.cs, where we have our create reservation viewModel function. We don't want to use this constructor. Instead, we want to use our new load viewModel method, which will kick the viewModel into loading and start executing our load reservations command automatically. So we are finally ready to test this out. We have our database, we have our services, we're using those services. Let's see this in action. All right, so we hit our load reservations command. Currently, we have no reservations. That's expected. But now let's make a reservation, submit that, and fail to make reservation. Darn. So let's see what our exception was. Oh, and I thought so. So it's our database reservation conflict validator. So we cannot do this complex mapping, which I did have a small feeling because I was like, how is this going to get translated into SQL? Which obviously it can't. So instead, we're just going to have to use a bunch of where filters that are going to be based off our reservation conflict method. So first, we want to filter for matching room IDs. So we can do a where, and we want to check if the DTO has a floor number that equals our incoming reservations room ID floor number. And then we also want to filter for matching room numbers, and then two more filters, and those are going to be for the start date and end date. So it is a conflict if the existing reservation's end time is greater than the incoming reservation's start time, and the existing reservation's start time is less than the incoming reservation's end time. And then we don't have to call conflicts anymore, which means we really don't need this conflicts method either. And this gives us back a reservation DTO. So we do have to map that to a reservation still, but we do have to keep in mind that this could be null. So if it is null, then we can just return null. All right, so this query is much simpler. It doesn't really look much simpler, but it's using simple types that should translate into SQL. Let's see this in action finally. So there we go, successfully reserved the room, thankfully. And now we get our reservations from the database. Let's restart this application. And there we go. There's our reservations. Let's try and get a conflict real quick. I forget the floor number and room number. Let's just try this. All right, the room is already taken. Perfect. Good guess. And there we go. Our logic is still there, except now we are using a database and we're interacting with that database via services. Now there's still much more to do. The most notable thing is that every time we go to the reservation listing page, we execute this load reservations command. So there we go, execute it on startup and go back, execute it again. And this is where stores could come in so that we could really load this data only once, and we can manage things like lazy loading as well. So that's actually where we're heading next. But there's other things we have to tackle, such as some UI work, styling, maybe loading indicators and error handling, and maybe setting up a dependency injection container for registering all of these services. But services, database interaction, definitely a crucial part to most applications, so hopefully you can apply this to your own application. If you have any questions, criticisms, or concerns, be sure to leave them below in the comment section. If you enjoyed the video or are enjoying the channel, consider becoming a member. Other than that, leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.